Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next, I have Saïd Moulin, who is the CEO of the Moroccan Agency for Energy Efficiency. Saïd, welcome. And next, we will have Hafiz Hanem, who is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. I think I should mention Egypt, because you're originally Egyptian. Yes. Okay. Welcome. Thank you. And last but not least, we have Miguel Moratinos, who's the High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations at the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and he joins us from Spain. Thank you so very much. Can I please have a stool? Thank you. So, gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. And the topic we're discussing combines two themes, which, are typically described as wicked problems. And the through line that runs through them is collaboration. And so, starting with Andreas, could you please give us your perspective of collaboration versus the competing interests that keep us stuck, that keep us deadlocked? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. It is absolutely great to have a meeting in person again in this important series of dialogues. I want to use those 3 minutes I have at the beginning in order to instill both a sense of urgency and a sense of mission in the debate, knowing that I'm the only climate guy with all the food guys here on the stage.
Saïd transition.
I will also transition somewhat, yeah. Don't worry. Okay. The point, however, is I come from a country in Germany where Fridays for Future was a whole generation of young people going onto the street, and this refers to the panel this morning, demanding that those in power today do something to secure their future. They were not heard and they were frustrated. The next iteration of that was then the Extinction Rebellion, and you hear the word rebellion already in that term. And even that is now yesterday's group. The group that is at the moment catching headlines is the last generation. They say the people who are in power today, that is us here in the room, are the last generation that has to act and must act, and still has the possibility, we have the solutions, in order to make sure that the planet remains livable, produces enough food for all of us. Last generation, they're sticking themselves onto the zebra crossings in the streets, onto the runways of the airports, in order to make everybody understand that we are in a crisis. And this is not a crisis just of climate, it is also the biodiversity loss, it's the loss of arable land, it's the loss of water resources, all of these topics we had in the various settings. When we look at global overheating, I don't like climate change. This is much too... Global overheating is what is happening. We have desertification. We have the additional extreme weather events, strong winds, strong precipitation, strong rain, washing away the topsoil. That all of that destroys arable land. We have the rising sea level. The rising sea level is going to take the most fertile arable land that we have on the planet, because it's the river deltas and it's the low river valleys. As the sea level rises, also the low-level rivers will rise, approximately in line with the sea level rise, and so the river valleys are also going to be inundated. Welcome to that truth, Egypt, please. We're going to lose all that arable land, and that is going to put a huge stress on our food security system. We also need to relocate all our cities. Practically all the cities we have on this planet, all the big ones anyway, are close to the sea, they're close to the river, they are in those fertile plains. And when they're relocated, they're going to eat up even more of the fertile land, and then you get the perfect storm that is going to reduce food security, our ability. Now, where are the solutions? I don't want to be all negative, but it needs to be said. The sense of mission, however, is we can coordinate, because what we have at the moment is not an absolute food shortage. The food crises that we have and the starvation and the hunger all in the world are bad, but they are problems of distribution, of infrastructure, of markets functioning or not functioning. There are various solutions that we can find because we humans have created those problems. We can solve them. we can coordinate that. We can also use the ocean. We call it planet Earth, and we are terrestrial animals, which is why we focus on the 30% of the Earth that is land. 70% is ocean. We should call it planet ocean. The ocean can produce a lot of food. It has done historically. We should restore the ocean to the status it had before industrial whaling. And then it can produce much more protein, much more carbon, and it can take the pressure off the land. But the condition is that we stop all the destructive practices in the ocean, and let's start with the Atlantic, where we have very similar legal systems. We have a homogeneous political culture, legal culture compared to other ocean basins around the world. This is an area where policy coordination is relatively easy. Let's start here, and let's not weigh ourselves down with the United Nations, 193 members all having to agree on one form of language. Just takes too long. We don't have the time. Let's get going just in the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Said, I'll come to you because Andreas paints a picture of what is possible, but there was a sting in the tail at the end against cooperation, which is don't wait for everybody to get on board. Let's just start with the Coalition of the Willing, which, to some extent, the Atlantic Basin represents. Where do you see cooperation from your perspective?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank again the Policy Center for the New South for this invitation. And it's really important today, especially this year. We saw what happened last summer on climate issue all over the continent, all over the world. And the climate issue is clear today. We have to be very, very strong on our policies, specifically in our continent. Today, in our continent, we were in Sharm el-Sheikh a few weeks ago, and we had discussions about all this energy issue for Africa, 600 million people without electricity today, and we are looking that we have solutions. During the COP22 in Marrakesh, the King organized an event with all head of state, African head of state, because we have African solution for Africa, especially in the context of the energy issue and the food security issue. And the link is clear. We were in discussion in Sharm el-Sheikh about this cold chain, sustainable cold chain. Africa is wasting almost 30% of the food produced because there is no cold chain. And there is no cold chain because there is no energy for that. So the link is clear. At the agency, and we have this in the Kingdom of Morocco, the chance that 10 years ago, when the King's letter gave priority to renewable energy and energy efficiency in our energy policy, with dedicated agencies, with objective to reach. We, as agency dedicated to all the small projects, we are helping farmers to switch from diesel pump to solar pumps. It's very important for food security also. We are helping farmers to use more renewables for cold chain. And that's why we had this agreement in cooperation with the African Association for the Cold Chain. And we are sharing our experience with technical support, with financial support sometimes. We convinced all the local banks in Morocco, but many local banks in Morocco are today in the whole continent. They are having offices in different countries in the continent, but because the link is clear. You need to train young people in Africa to install, maintain those projects. You need to have in Africa actors who can finance that. Local banks are financing today solar pumps in Morocco. Local banks are financing all this sustainable energy for citizens, in small industries. It's important to have a design. The cooperation is clear, and I'm glad that we had another program we developed with Spain, North-South cooperation, first, so that we are helping some issues in different regions in the country. And we were in Dakar with the North-South-South cooperation. What we did in Morocco, we are now doing it in Senegal with the agency in Senegal, and we are helping actors, farmers, to also switch to the solar pumps. We are helping this cold chain to be developed. It's important, and the experience that we have in Africa today, in many countries, we can share it, we can develop it with different countries in the
Sorry,
continent.
what I'm hearing you say is a robust defense of collaboration, of cooperation, and trying to get everybody on board.
Because solutions are here. We know the solutions. We need to find the best solutions in each country, in each context. That's why the approach, we were in Senegal, but we are also discussing in Comore Island and in Tanzania, and we are discussing with different partners, and in each context, we find what can be the solution, the African solution for Africa.
Okay.
That is very important for us.
Hafez, I'll come to you. From your perspective, how do you see collaboration versus the competing interests that would undermine it?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Right now, if we look at what's happening in the world, and I was looking at this report that FAO and WFP produces every year, it's called Hunger Hotspots. And they find that there are 220 million people in those hunger hotspots who are suffering from hunger today, undernourishment. This is the highest number that they have ever found since they started producing this report, I think, a decade ago. And of those 220 million people, more than 2/3 are in Africa. So I really want to focus a little bit more on Africa. Well, first, let us understand why has hunger increased so dramatically this year? And there are 4 reasons. One, we already mentioned, which is climate change. And if you look at what is happening across the continent in terms of extreme weather conditions, in the Horn of Africa and East Africa, we had the worst droughts in centuries. We had locust attacks. In the same droughts in northern Nigeria, but in southern Nigeria and the rest of West Africa, we had floods that destroyed the production, agricultural production, and led to much more hunger. So the climate is a really important factor. Another important factor is conflict. If we look at the biggest countries, the countries and the areas in Africa where we have most hungry people and hungry children, 1/3 of African children are stunted today. And you will find it's in areas where there's conflict, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, in northern Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So conflict is the other reason. 4th reason is the disruption that has been caused by the pandemic. The disruption in the logistics system that has been, 3rd reason, disruption of the logistics system caused by the pandemic. And finally, the 4th reason is the increase in food prices due to the war and the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is the situation we have today. And when I look at the situation in Africa, I'm coming to your point on collaboration soon enough. If you look at the situation in Africa, you will realize that actually this is not a short-term thing. Undernourishment in Africa has been double the rate in the rest of the world for a long, long time. And it has been increasing even before the pandemic and even before the war in Ukraine. So it's a structural problem. And it's a structural problem which is going to get worse because of climate change. You know, 50% of Africans work in agriculture. Yet Africa is a net food importer. It spends $50 billion every year on net food imports. And whenever there is a shock, we see people dying of hunger and suffering. So and if you look at all of those people working in agriculture, you look at productivity in agriculture in Africa, it is less than 1/3 of the world's average. And so there is really a need. The first point that I want to make is that there is really a need of working to increase agricultural productivity, to increase access to food on the continent. Now, we have 54 different countries in Africa. And that's, now I get to your point. I don't believe that you can achieve food security one country at a time. Even Africa's giant, Nigeria, is unable to achieve food security on its own. And that's why I'm arguing for collaboration among African countries. A collaboration to increase agricultural productivity in the continent, to make agriculture and food, the food system much more resilient to climate change, and therefore add collaboration to get rid of child malnutrition and stunting. So I don't know if you want me to continue. I would suggest 5 areas of collaboration.
I'll ask you for those later.
Okay.
Let me give a chance to, okay, thank you. Let me give a chance to Miguel to give us your thoughts on collaboration and how you see it interplay in terms of achieving food security and addressing the climate crisis.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here again. I started the first meeting here in Marrakesh a long time, years ago. So I'm very proud to see how it has developed. But you will allow me to speak in Spanish in order not to really have this dictatorship of English language and having the opportunity to express myself. So I give some time for the audience. I think we should practice this multicultural, multilinguistic, because, we are going to be robots, Algorithm is going to prevail. So I did in purpose. Estoy en este panel.
I am in this panel somehow unexpectedly. I am currently the High Representative for the Alliance of Civilizations at the United Nations, and people may be wondering, why is this man going to speak about food security and climate change? And therefore, my intervention will go beyond the context of that of my predecessors, but along the same lines, verging on food security and climate change. I was a candidate to the FAO. I have some experience in food security. I lived in Qatar for a year and a half, implementing a project of the Global Alliance of Arab countries for food security, and I know a little bit about this topic. What I want to convey to all of you, however, is that these 2 main elements that are part of the 2030 agenda will not be resolved if we continue to work the way we have been doing so. And therefore, sometimes we have to go back to the essentials. What is the essence of global governance? Well, issues around food security were pioneering in the new international governance. Maybe the youth who are listening today may not know this, but in some North American town, Hot Springs, in 1943, they had the first meeting before the Charter of San Francisco, and they said that food security was absolutely necessary in the new agenda after World War II. 3 years later, the FAO was created. The climate change came later. We can name the Conference of Stockholm in 1973. It wasn't something that would concern the world leaders at the time. And however, both of these 2 aspects are part of the main elements of that 2030 agenda for sustainable development. You may remember the audience that in the Millennium Development Goals, nobody remembers those, which should have been met by 2015, fighting poverty and fighting hunger was the objective number 1, the goal number 1. Food security was number 1. Now in the 2030 agenda, Fighting hunger, fighting poverty are goal number 2, well, 1 and 2, and then fighting climate change is goal number 13. And what's going on? Well, the same mistakes are being made. What is more important? If I was to ask you which of the 17 Sustainable Goal Development is more important? Climate change, food security, education, cities? Which one? Women? Today, the minister from Chile talked about the role of women around the world. Is a poor, hungry child able to defend and fight against climate change? Is a child living in a suburb in the outskirts of some Latin American or African or European city, for that matter, can he be able to defend the causes to fight climate change and fight for greener cities? We are making a serious mistake. Because at the end of the day, what we need to put or to make right is the international governance altogether. And in order to do that, we have to go back to the essentials. Yesterday, I was able to attend the wonderful intervention by the economists who said that we are not doing it right. Okay, fine. No money. Fair enough. And then I wonder, they speak about the politicians, the political class. When I was a candidate to the FAO, I had 4 main objectives in mind. First of all, the political will. Why are we not making progress in climate change? Again, it goes down to political will. Secondly, a legal framework that makes you comply with your objectives and your requirements. And then number 3, technology. Obviously, we have the experts to hand. We can and do know how to improve the response against climate change and for food security. And then we are lacking financial resources. Some 10 years ago, they were requesting $30 billion per year to guarantee food security. How many billions would we need today?
The resources. If you added education, imagine education, primary education, secondary education, university education, plus. And where they got the money? To increase the military expenditure. Every second there is 5 children dying by hunger. Now, during our session, so many people are going to die. But we don't reduce the 4 million expenditure per day in the world. So either we change the way we are going to conduct the future, or, with all my respect, I fully agree with what they are going to say. They are doing a fantastic job, but we will not succeed. And I end my first intervention. Can you ask the poor Ukrainian people if they are very much concerned about having a climate change incident now? They want to have the Dnieper River blue? What they want is peace, to stop the war. So political element is the first essential issue that we have to take care. If there's no political understanding between the leaders, the country, the people, to make a world to live together, that is what I'm trying to do in my work, all these efforts, either food security, climate change, you are already suffering due to the war. How is going to be implemented the agreement of Sharm el-Sheikh? How are going to state donate this fund for compensation for Africa? What is the impact of the war on food security? So that is the essential. Okay. So of course we have to make peace with nature. But we have first to make peace among humanity, among ourselves. That's the only way to survive.
Okay, so what you've heard as an opening intervention is extremes. We don't need everyone. Let's start with a coalition of the willing. And at the other end of the spectrum is if we don't get everyone on board, we're not doing anything. And so I'd like to turn my attention to you in the audience and your opinions. And I'd like to ask you from your perspective, given the enormity of the crises before us, what is missing in the conversations about collaboration on climate change? You might want to call it global warming. What is missing in the conversations about collaboration on food security? Yeah, so if you get your phones out, yeah, and go to the device and click on word cloud. And we compromise, okay, education, it's still running. You still have some time. Women. Women is important, which is why we had the Gender Fund launched at COP27. Urgency. Financing gap. Commodity markets, pragmatism. Young leaders, you're in the room. Co-responsibility, trust, accountability. Stop capitalism. Andreas agrees with you. Vision. Coherence. Financing. Who will pay? Okay. I think the clock has stopped on this. And so, panelists, I'd ask you to respond to the perspectives from the audience on collaboration. And there seems to be general consensus. One, that there's an urgency lacking, and I think you spoke to that, Andreas. Political will. Miguel was just making that point very strongly and eloquently. Youth perspectives is coming out quite strongly. Action. Reflect on these, if you will, and how we then move ourselves forward. I'll start with you, Andreas.
Okay, yes, thank you. You picked up the point on capitalism. I'm going to come back to that. But first of all, I just want to make sure the sense of urgency and the lack of action, the other point that is in there. If we waste more decades negotiating in the UN system, we're going to lose so much time that our solutions, even if we are sure we have them, will come too late. We have to stop talking and believing that these formats in the United Nations, with the obligation of consensus, with the need to create package deals and satisfy everybody's little pet project, that has to stop. We need to move into a mission thinking, a mission economy and mission diplomacy in order to make sure that the most urgent problems are addressed, and not just addressed with language, but addressed with action and with the financing behind that. And I would say that during the attack of Russia on Ukraine, we have also seen something that you may disagree with some of the points and some of the intentions of some of the actors, but it was one of those star hours of food diplomacy, where it was possible, whilst the war was being fought over their shoulders, they were able to resume shipment of grain out of Ukraine ports and not feed the world, that would be too strong, but at least resume some of the supply lines and ease some of the pressure. And I think we need to recognize that at this darkest hour that Russia has imposed, not only on Ukraine, but on liberal democracies everywhere and the rules-based system internationally, it has been possible to create that very specific action. And that is possible because people focused on the mission. And if we focus on the mission of decarbonizing our economies, rolling out renewable energies, reforming the food system so that we don't have the food losses and that we produce resilient crops, if we also please deal with the question of capitalism. Capitalism itself is not bad, but what we have at the moment is 4 companies that control most of the trade in food commodities, and we have nobody able to understand what they're doing in technology terms, in market access terms, in how they finance, how they trade, how they discriminate prices. There is nobody having the data to possibly regulate them, and that is wrong. Because that is anarchy. That's not a functioning market, that is anarchy, and that is something that needs to be stopped. And if we negotiate in FAO the right framework for that, I'm afraid it's going to take too long. I think we need a different mechanism for dealing with those companies.
I'll come to you in a minute for your questions. You can put them into the chat on the phone, on the AD Talks app, if you have burning questions. But let me hear from you, Hafiz, because you spoke strongly to the fact that most of the hungry, the food insecure countries in the world are in Africa. You also, painted very clearly the link between conflict and food insecurity. So when we hear, there's a lack of urgency, as the audience told us that youth perspectives are missing, there's no vision. And we have this example that Andreas has just given us of food diplomacy. Why then do we still have food insecure countries?
Well, no, thank you. And I will steal one of Miguel's favorite word, political will. But I will not talk about political will for the world in general. I will talk about political will among African leaders. As an African, it hurts me to see African kids dying of hunger, to see people, Africans, suffering and waiting for handouts and support from humanitarian around the world. I think that if you need a political will, you need the African leaders to work together to stop this. And the idea is really to improve. Africa can feed itself.
And the world.
Yes, well, let's start by feeding ourselves first. Africa can feed itself. We have the resources, we have the capacity to feed ourselves. So what do we need to do to deal with this? And I think we need to work in 5 areas. The first area is let us capitalize on the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Let us first of all start by sharing and allowing food commodities to flow across borders. I mean, I'm not going to name countries, but there are several African countries who stopped exports or stopped imports from their neighbors. That should end, and we should really have a single African market for food. Second, once you achieve that, you need, the percentage of irrigated land in Africa is 1/7 of the world average. So you need to do a lot of investment in land and in irrigation in the continent. And instead of every country trying to produce its own, now if we're going to have a single market for food on the continent, let us do some large continental projects. And we have potential bread baskets across Africa. Look at Nigeria, look at Tanzania, look at Sudan. There is so much potential. I am arguing that we should get the African Union, we should get the African leaders to agree on some few projects where we would invest. Third area, Africa imports 60% of its fertilizers. The cost of fertilizers in many African countries is double the price of fertilizers in the United States. And the result is that we use very little fertilizers and that our productivity is 1/3 of the productivity around the world. So why can't Africa produce its own fertilizers? We're here in Morocco. We have OCP, that's a great fertilizer producer. Look at Nigeria. Dangote just built one of the largest fertilizer factories in the world. So we should do that across the continent, and we should do that jointly. I forgot which number now. I think it's 4th. It is research. You need it is important to use modern technology in agriculture, to have an agriculture that is resilient to climate change, to have an agriculture that fits. And you cannot just copy the technology in Europe or in America and apply it to Africa, you have to adapt it to local conditions. In Africa, on average, we are spending $50 per year per farmer on research. This is 1/10 of what the rest of the world is doing. And therefore, it is very hard for each of the 54 African countries to build a world-class research, agricultural research center there. What I'm suggesting is that let's look at what the Indians are doing. India has 28 states, and they have the Indian Center for Agricultural Research that is centralized, but that is working with local centers in the 28 states. Why can't we do that on the continent? We don't need to have 54 local centers. If we have 4 or 5 centers across the continent and a strong central body. So that can be done. Let's look at, we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
So you have
but that requires one last point. Mm-hmm. The 5th point is financing for dealing with shocks. Yeah. We have an instrument, an institution called the Africa Exim Bank. And we need to have their financing available so that when a small African country is hit by a shock and it needs to import food, they should have access, quick access to funding to import food and not wait for handouts from the rest of the world. Okay. So this is what I mean about having the political will to work together and to solve this.
Hafiz, your final point addresses one of the questions that was raised in the word cloud, which was who will pay? Because everything you're describing also speaks to the point that Africa sometimes seems to be penalized in terms of what it pays to access knowledge, research, technology. So beyond the African Exim Bank, if Africa is paying 10 times as much to access, I don't know, fertilizers or whatever it is, surely there's a deeper underlying structural and systemic issue playing out, is there not?
Well, certainly, and that's where working together we can have a voice. If each one of the 54 countries tries to go out and negotiate on its own, it's in a very, very weak position. The whole of Africa, 1.4 billion people, that's the size of India. Then you can sit and talk. But that would require political will and agreement among all the African leaders. Mm-hmm. And of course, the big area where you need political will is to end conflict. I mean, if you look at the hotspots in Africa today, it's in Ethiopia, in Tigray, because of the conflict there. It's because of the conflict in the Sahel, in northern Nigeria, in eastern DRC. So we need to work on those technical things that I mentioned. Okay. That requires political will, but also you need a higher level of political will that I'll let Miguel talk about, which is to end those conflicts.
Right. Said, I'll come to you before I go to Miguel, because we also heard things like vision, and you eloquently laid out what Morocco has been doing. So we see vision playing out in Morocco, but somehow, as we listen to Hafiz, we see all these squandered opportunities.
Definitely, because when we are comparing Africa and India, it is clear, and I'm glad because it is so important. With the same population in area 10 times less than Africa, they manage to feed all their people. We are working with OCP. In the 80s, OCP has an agreement with India. And today, the cooperation inside Africa with OCP in Nigeria, Ethiopia, in many countries in the continent, it's clear that we can reach this food security in our continent because we have all the tools on fertilizing, sustainable fertilizing, affordable fertilization. It's very important. And what is done right now is really to help the small farmers. I was talking about solar pumping for small farmers before.
Actually, I want to put a question to you because you seem to be answering it. And this comes from Hajar, who asks, how do we increase the productivity of some of the most acute regions of the world No, Africa holds 60% of the world's arable land. How do we ensure that we increase productivity without jeopardizing or degrading the land?
Yeah.
And I put that question to you because you were talking about sustainable fertilizers.
And the sustainability means economic, it means environmental friendly, and social impact, with social impact. On all those points, especially for food security or for energy or for water issue. That's why we had this, when we're talking about strong political will at the highest level of the state, it's very important. It is how we manage to have this, Morocco is ranked now today 4 in the IPCC, in the Climate Change Performance Index. We are 7th, but the 3 first ranks are empty. Like in football, today we are in 4th in the world. Huh? But I would say that in this field, why we have this strong political will, because when you're talking about sustainable policy, it's implemented to all sectors, energy one, water one, but also food security, but also in transport, and all sectors are concerned by this approach for climate change issue. What we say is today, we believe in our continent, this cooperation that we are doing right now, OCP with different countries, but also agencies are working with different agencies in the continent, in the energy field, in the climate issue. It is the way how we manage to have this approach. But what we are saying to our partners in Africa, you need this political will in your country. You need to have the support. When talking about financial support, we were discussing about financial support that we can have through actors, or what we discussed in Sharm el-Sheikh about how we're going to finance this energy transition in the continent. We have the support now because we have the chance that this energy transition is completely economic. It's the cheapest way today to produce energy. It's the cheapest way is done through solar and wind power. This is a chance for Africa. This is a chance that we can do it completely in an economic way, this energy transition. We need support for investment. What we were discussing is all this investment that is needed for that. But really, we are in this, when you have the strong political actions developed in the government, when you have the dedicated agencies, when you have the legislations, we didn't talk about that, but many countries, you cannot develop some project because the legislation cannot allow it. So we need to have governance and legal framework adapted to that. That's all what you need. Of course, you need governance, and you can attract all the green financing for those projects. So that's why I'm not scared about financing those projects. I'm more scared about governance, about transparency in contract between partners. During the COP22, I was in charge of the Public-Private Partnership Commission. This Public-Private Partnership is very important because all those projects are developed through the private sector. And we have the chance to have the private sector involved in this energy transition. In Africa, we are discussing with African private sector, with the different confederation for private enterprises, how they can be developing projects in their country and in this energy transition program, in this food security program. What was done in Nigeria, I think, it was the objective that the small farmer in Nigeria can have access to affordable fertilization products. It is important to have that in mind. When you look at all those points, you can reach your objective in this field.
Okay. Miguel, Said made the point, and I think your fellow panelists have made the point. Well, they've agreed with your point about political will. Said was talking about being more concerned about political processes than with the actual technical inputs required to move the needle, whether it's on climate security or climate change rather, or food security. And you've given us a historical recounting of the various attempts to put both at the center of political consensus. So given your experience and where you sit from the UN, which works on consensus, how do we change this? right? You've told us, quite rightly, that if you're in Mali, facing insecurity, the last thing on your mind is, climate change and, biodegradables, and the same if you're in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, the answer of the audience was political will, was urgency. We have to move urgently because the situation in the globe is not very promising these days, and political will. Well, my German colleagues say, well, stop to this talking. In the UN, we didn't get consensus. What to have UN? Let's have a fact mission. Well, the UN, with all my respect, is the only umbrella till now that have succeeded to have everybody on board. And as the virus of COVID-19 has demonstrated, as climate change is demonstrated, of all the challenges of today, we are in a global village. We are in a one planet, one humanity. So with all my respect, either you use the UN that have to be reformed, that the recent Secretary General is launching the common new agenda. We have, of course, to produce the capacity to everybody to express themselves, to move forward. But we have not to ignore that the UN is United Nations. That means that the Secretary General or whatever conference of the UN is produced by member states. And so we have to respect member states. So how we create this new consensus, or how we move forward? Of course, the sector, private sector, absolutely necessary. I don't have any problem with the way, capitalism has tried to solve some problem, but has also failed. I'm a social democrat, so I have something to say about capitalism. But it's not today the issue. Let's have the private sector and private sector working together. And we are in 21st century. This morning, other participants have mentioned about the complexity. We talk that the world is complex, the challenges are complex, but then we don't behave in this complexity methodological work. And so when we talk about climate change, and they say climate change, and we don't see the interaction of other issues, as I say, of the 17 development objective, sustainable development goals. So Edgar Morin is a French politologist. He lives now in Marrakech, 101 years old. He had what he called la pensée complexe, the thinking, the complex thinking. So let's give to the decider, the political decider, the capacity to analyze the reality in this complexity. So I'm against of what is now trying to be part of the new agenda. That is what I call, or the French will say, le multilatéralisme à la carte. I explain myself. So multilateralism à la carte is that we are going to fight each other in order to have an hegemony over this, the other, but in the climate change we can't discuss. So let's choose one issue of the agenda where we can sit around the table. But once we are out of the climate change, we started wars, we look for the technological war. That is not a world that can survive. There is no way to have multilateralism à la carte because we are interdependent, but not physically, even in the issues. How you are going to maintain the research, or how you are going to facilitate the food security if you don't have a good governance, as Amer Moussa said this morning. So all is interrelated. So we have to start to know, to behave in this complexity methodology of work. If not, we will have no problem. Final word, of course, I'm not against regionalization. And I think my friends say Africa is a good model you have now, and we have to concentrate on that. I fully support you. But we have not to forget the big angle. Because if we forget the big angle, with all good intention, you will have a missing action for climate change. You have the best expert, the best new technology. They can't really succeed to put everything green, all the blue color. But if the people don't accept you, because it's coming from the West, and they have fed up with the West, you will not be to have this mission. And that's this part of the world. We will affect you. You will not be all those. So with all my respect, this crisis that has been, inverted commas, solved by the UN, by the way, with Turkey about the grain export that we have facilitated, was not the first one. In 2008, with the financial crisis, the food prices and the food product was a kind of market of the future. And there was a speculation. And we have a spike of prices of food in 2008. But we don't have memory. So I don't need any war to have an interest on food security, please. I want to have food security without war.
Thank you. So the floor is open.
Maintenant, nous allons entamer une séance de questions-réponses. Donner la parole à l'auditoire.
And global peace. We will work our way across the room, okay, in this way. Is that all right? So let me start with this side. We'll take a couple of questions. Panelists, you have very rich expertise. I'll ask you to be as concise as possible, because as you can see, there's several hands up of people who want to engage with you. I'll also ask the same of you as you ask your questions. To the gentleman right there, thank you. And then you, yes, okay.
Thank you very much. Very rich discussion. As highlighted by many of the speakers, we know the solutions. Has been published, we could read the reports, but I'd like to go back to Mr. Moratino's question on governance, but specifically about who pays for it. We expect that the deltas will be full of water because of sea rise and many other locations. We know that what needs to be done is the farmer who's barely making it is able to pay for the reclamation of that land or the salt accumulation. So do we have the governance structure to pay for the damage that's been made by the West, by the countries of the developed countries, and the impact is felt most by the poorest of the globe that cannot pay for that. So what's this dilemma? What's the solution for that dilemma without having a proper governance that is responsible for these impacts?
The gentleman in front had a question.
Hello, my name is LeVar Thomas. I'm from the US. I'm also an emerging leader. Within the climate change and food security discussion, there is also a racial justice crisis where marginalized populations across the global north and south are disproportionately impacted. So my question is, how can we effectively address climate change, food security, and environmental injustice while factoring the role of systemic inequality?
Okay. And she's got a question right behind you.
Hello, my name is Afaf. I'm an economist at the Policy Center for the New South. So my question today is, climate change is one of the stickiest policy problems of the 21st century. One of the reasons because of the very short-term horizons of government versus the very long-term horizon of climate change as a long-term problem. So my question is, how do we ensure that there isn't a mismatch between the very short-term horizon of key stakeholders, including government, and which encourage policy flip-flopping or policy back and forth?
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple of questions from this side, and then I'll allow you to respond to them. Yes.
My name is Charles Tahad. Said, we met in Sharm el-Sheikh. One of the biggest questions in Sharm el-Sheikh was education, but we also talk about, we're talking about who is going to pay. Most of the farmers and the poverty are the people who cannot afford to pay. And one of the things that came up at Sharm el-Sheikh was that if we don't resolve poverty, we won't resolve climate change. One is in the other. It's part of it, and we need to take that out of the capitalism and figure out how to feed the world.
So that sounds more like a comment? Yeah, okay. No, right next to you. Sorry, right next to you? Oh, this way, thank you.
Sorry. Yasmin Hisnawi, university professor at the American University in Kuwait. I'm just going to follow up on what you stated, Mr. Moratinos. You said you want to have food security without war. Our global system is so intertwined. Nowadays, we have seen the resources are diminishing as the world is trying to feed more than 8 billion people. From your own perspective, how much of a threat is food insecurity to global security? Thank you.
Okay. And right at the back. Yes. Sorry, did you have your hand? I couldn't see it. It's okay.
Okay, thanks. I'm Giovanni Henry, one of the emerging leaders from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, like I love to say. And of course, we're also in a region where we're tired of talking about the challenges, and it's all about the solutions. And of course, in speaking about solutions, the financing element is critical. Now, I know we talk about where is the money, and on the other hand, you're here in the case where the money is available, but it's just not getting to the areas that are most in need. So my question to the panelists is, looking at the current existing financing landscape for climate finance and so on, what financing instruments or mechanisms which you think we can look to explore in this modern era that would allow us to scale up financing for more climate resilient food systems and agriculture within our countries?
Okay, thank you. And the last question from this side, the gentleman right here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Karl Bernadac from the French Development Agency, AFD. Thank you very much for this very insightful discussion. Maybe a follow-up question on the gentleman on international financing, and we're talking about new climate finance regime and loss and prejudice and so forth. So what is your views on the need to revive international financing? I mean, on one side we have ODA, but which is in a way of voluntary solidarity. Maybe we should focus on poverty in specific state, but then for loss and for climate change impact affecting food security, it's more an issue of responsibility on insurance, right, and contractual engagement rather than voluntary assistance like ODA is. So this would be the first revival. The second one would be geographically, because ODA is from the north to the south, and now we are mixing boundaries, geographical boundaries, if we talk about loss and prejudice. So what is your view on that? Thank you. And the third one, sorry, and I stop there, is how do we rethink economy to overcome this sectorial, as you said, we have ODA 1 to 7, and we need to have a comprehensive view on how economy function, and our neoclassical model do not address that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's answer that round of questions as briefly as we can so that we can take another round from the rest of the room. Is that all right? So there were several questions clustered around financing, who pays, financial instruments. I suspect Andres and Hafez, you might probably be best placed for that.
I have to say something about financing.
And then there was a specific question for you. So would you like to start, Andreas?
Yes, thank you, Urwak. But I want to preface this by saying something. I don't think we're that far apart. You know, we all have done it. If you want to wreck a meeting, you start a discussion about the agenda and how much time should be spent on each point and which one should come first. This is a little bit what we have done here, and that is something that is always repeated when people bring up the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the 169 sub-goals, and the about 1,170 items that you need to look at. It is one of the ways is we agree that it is all interconnected, and we agree that we still need to keep focus in order to organize action and the financing around it. I think that would be. The other thing I want to say is on climate finance, the most important thing at the moment is subsidy reform. The world is still spending $650 billion a year subsidizing the production, the trade, and the consumption of fossil energy. Now, that is definitely wrong. Take that money away and you have it in order to finance other things. And yes, we do have the regime of loss and damage that is being negotiated, that will be refined, and the others will speak about that. But whilst we are looking at reforms, let's please also look at commodity markets. Not only fossil commodity, but also agricultural commodities. The big agricultural commodities, they all come from the temperate climate zones. Africa's agriculture will not be in that zone. So there will have to be markets for new commodities in the global scale, even if they look like traditional foods to those people who produce them and have traditionally consumed them in Africa. We need to rethink what is the best form of agriculture for Africa, given the high insulation, the fact that you need canopy cover or solar panel cover in order to grow food without wasting too much water, and how do we develop the markets, the commodity markets, so that Africa can feed itself, but can also earn money by feeding others. Thank you.
Thank you. Hafiz, I'll come to you, for your perspectives on financing instruments, but also, as the gentleman asked, particularly, with a focus on equity.
Well, let me start with the second question, because I think it's a very, very important point on the issue of justice and how it is important for not just food security, but also for poverty reduction. And I did a study a while back, which was, it was not focusing on racial justice, but it was focusing on gender justice. Comparing, in Africa, we have more women actually working in agriculture than men, but the productivity of the women is 1/3 lower than the productivity of the men. And why is that? It's because they have less, they're given the worst land, they don't have access to financing, they don't have access to fertilizers, they don't have access to markets. So you calculate that if you deal with this injustice...
They also don't have tenure, ownership of the land.
They don't, yeah, access to land, they don't have access to... So if you deal with this injustice, to provide the women with the same opportunities as the men, you could just with a back of the envelope type calculation, increase yields by 30%. So yes, I mean, I'm an economist, so I tend to be hard-nosed about those things, but I've become a feminist based on some hard-nosed economic analysis. And I've become a great believer in dealing with racial and ethnic injustice because of the kinds of economic pain that they're causing, and how everybody will win by dealing with those injustices. I mean, back to my gender example, if you increase the women's productivity by 30%, it's not just that the women will benefit, it's the men too. Everybody in society benefits. So it is society pays the cost of those injustices and those inequalities. On the financing, actually, I believe that we need to take a look at the current institutions and instruments available. I do not believe, I mean, if you look at the needs just for climate, the needs are huge. The old-fashioned ODA will not cover it. We can yell and scream as much as we want and ask the governments to pay up, especially coming out of the COVID crisis with the huge deficits that they're facing. With all the money that they're spending on wars, they don't have the resources to cover it. Now, if you look at what needs to be spent on mitigation, I'm looking at the Global South. On mitigation, the biggest cost item in the Global South is the energy transition. On adaptation, the biggest cost item, you don't agree, but well...
Sorry, we have 12 minutes to go,
12?
and there are people still wanting to ask questions.
Okay, the biggest adaptation is on agriculture and food security. We need to be able to mobilize new types of finance, maybe more private finance. And the institutions we have in the world today, whether it's the World Bank or the United Nations, are not geared up for that. So what can we do? How can we attract those investments in the South? How can we attract green investments? What kind of guarantees you need to give to those investors? And I believe that those are things that require a fresh look at the international financial structure.
Thank you. Said, you want to say something?
Very important for us because we managed in Morocco to attract financing for big projects on solar plant, on
How did you do it?
It is clear today when you have governance, when you have transparency in the contract, you can attract all the green financing for big projects. Solar wind park, more than $1 billion investment, you can attract green financing. The unfair part of that, when we're talking about, we were helping farmers to switch from diesel pump to solar pumps. We didn't manage to have this green financing for them. We managed to have, we can have this financing for big projects, but not for small projects, and that's unfair. One thing, how we did, it was mentioned why we need to have people doing investment in this energy transition. Farmers in Morocco are doing this investment. Why? Because we have to convince them that it is economic.
You incentivize them.
We stopped subsidizing diesel. So the payback for them, the solar pump, is not 10 years anymore, it's less than 5 years. Another point is that we train people in their area. It is very important. Capacity building, education, it's very important. It is how we manage to, you need sensitizing people, you need financing adapted, and how we manage to finance that with local banks. We have Tamwil Fallah, it's a local bank dedicated to farmers, and they have dedicated loans for solar pumps. So when you have sensitization, when you have capacity building training, when you have financing, you are today having 60,000 farmers in Morocco using solar pumping.
Okay.
And it's how we manage to reach these objectives.
Beautiful lessons. Thank you, Said. Miguel?
To comment on financing. First, about what today is considered an obsolete instrument. That was the traditional official development aid, no? There was a very prestigious foreign minister, when foreign ministers were important, person 45 years ago, that decided to create, you know, this proposal 0.7% of GDP to give a voluntary basis to the developing countries. Well, today, the wealthy countries, they don't reach 0.7. So I think there should be a kind of call to say either you pay 1% of our GDP because you are ready to pay 2-3% for military expenditure. The NATO, they said we have to increase your expenditure 2% of your budget, but you are not ready to pay 1% of your budget for this development goal. Second, new innovative mechanism of financing. We have to be creative. And we have this word of digitalization. Well, when I was candidate for FAO, I lost, so I couldn't implement my promise. I was going to propose what they call a call for fighting hunger. That means that each ITT mobile company have to agree that each call will pay 0.01% of all the call that is going around the world. And on voluntary basis for the person. So I'm convinced that you ask all the audience, are you ready to pay in all your calls 0.01% of your call for a food security program? They will say yes. Why we don't invest in this innovative mechanism that can solve this financial crisis?
Thank you. This side has questions, and we have just about 5 minutes left. Can you make them as short as possible?
As short as I can.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. On this subject, I think there's a major point that is not discussed.
Okay.
Talk about climate change and food security. You need to bring it down to earth, which is land and water. When you bring it down to earth, land and water, you need to talk about land reform, not a bad word, land reform and irrigation. Land reform is where you do not have political will. because the people who have the land do not want to give it away. I just give you one instance where what you do with land
there's a whole
is
line
important.
of people. Sorry, please, we get the point. There's a
Yeah,
question
okay,
next to
good.
you.
That's
Yeah,
the
thank
point.
you.
That's
Thank
the
you.
point you should look at.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Yeah, follow up on this one. We have all the ingredients. We have the Agenda 2030. We have the Agenda 2063. We have the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing. We have the SDGs and the 75th anniversary in the United Nations. Funding is a problem in funding is that developed countries want their funding to be targeted to specific countries or to specific regional groups. So you have the TCAD for Africa, about $30 billion over 3 years. You have the FOCAC for Africa, about $60 billion over 3 years. You have others, and they want this to be targeted. They don't want it to be going through the international system. So it has to go back to the international system. We have a summit on water in March next year. It has to be, we have to prioritize on this water. We have the review of the SDGs, the midterm. It's coming in September 2023. We will do it. We have also a ministerial to prepare for the summit of the future that's going to take place in 2024.
So what I'm hearing is a comment.
This is a comment. This is not a question.
Okay, I think there are questions there. Thank you.
Great. So we've talked about political will. I'm a sitting member of parliament from Canada. I was the first member to raise the need for Canada to increase aid and support. The issue, though, that I will face, and politicians from all democracies, is our political opponents will say, hey, Kevin cares more about people abroad than his constituents at home. So what is the path forward for us to be able to do that?
Thank you.
My name is Jonas. I'm from Ethiopia. Thank you very much indeed for bringing out those facts hidden, not known in the world. So just my question focuses on climate justice. Both climate problem as well as conflict are very much linked to the troubling, challenging past colonialism had in Africa in general, to be honest. So as to heal the past wounds, what could, would, or should, or must the global north do? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll leave it there because we're at 3 minutes and we've got 4 panelists. So the math is not, as we say in Africa, it's not mathing, but we will do our best. And so I'll start with you, Miguel. Given Kevin's question around, people who want to do well, but who are then accused of abandoning their local constituencies, but also the question that Jonas asks, which is important, the global north. And these will be your final comments. So give us your closing ideas as you respond to these questions. Thank you.
Answering this question, I will answer the comment about food security and wars and in versus terms.
Okay.
How do you convince your constituency? You are in a global world. Of course, you are in Canada. They vote for you. But they don't want the people to go for war or be killed in NATO exercise. So how we avoid terrorism? You have to go to the food causes, the root causes. If you don't are able to explain to your constituency that we are in a global planet and that you have to take care of the other in order to take care better of you, for Marcia, you are a bad politician. Because you have to convince your people, not the people have to convince you. Politics are the ones who convey to the electorate. Of course, they listen, but they lead. The problem today that they are managers. They are not political people that have a project. And so if you have a project, you follow the polls. And they say, you have to vote, no, not a single penny to this African. Where is this Burkina Faso? What the hell to go to Burkina Faso? But if you are clever enough to run a country and to be MP of Canada, a great country, you have to have the vision to convince your people. And for that, you are absolutely right. If we have a good food security resolve, we will avoid wars and conflict. Because we will have people
They have hunger, they are hunger. They are hungry because they are hunger. So the, how you call it, the Arab Spring was a result, part of that, of the food security problem. And there are statistics that demonstrate if you have food security problem, you can have more riots and more conflict and more crises. So everything is dependent. But for me, the main element is peace and sustainable development. That should be our agenda, not peace and security. Every time what we are going to have in the world and UN, blah, 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 UN, blah, 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 UN, blah, 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 but UN was trying to have the goal, the Millennium Goals, and we were ready for the Millennium Goal. We intervened in Iraq, and we put the agenda, the security agenda at the top. When we were now going for the 2030 agenda of the 17 objectives, the SDG, we have this war in Ukraine, and so the security is prevailing about sustainable development. We are kidnapped, so peace and sustainable development should be the agenda.
Thank you. Hafiz?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words on a question that was raised before that nobody responded to, which is on poverty and climate change. And actually, I feel that we should not put poverty and climate change as two competing objectives. Actually, there are many solutions, win-win solutions for poverty reduction and for dealing with climate change. The best example is green technology in energy. If you look at Africa, you have more than half of Africa that has no access to energy right now. We should leapfrog right away into green technology, and that is how the new technologies that are developed for climate change can support poverty reduction. The same thing in agriculture, with all the new modern ways. So that is the point I really would like to make, is that it is a mistake to put poverty and climate change as competing objective. There are win-win solutions, win for the climate and win for the poor.
Thank you. Said, your closing thoughts.
Climate justice. It is important that it's clear today we managed to have those big projects financed by development banks. They are here today, the development banks. They are financing the big projects. It's much easier to finance big projects than thousands or millions of small projects. Or for climate justice, we need to find financing to local banks with the development banks for this climate justice to help all those small projects to be implemented. They can really solve the problem of energy supply for citizens in the continent, but also for farmers. So all those projects can be developed, because if you have the right approach, but if you have the development banks also financing those small projects, it will be one of the solutions.
Okay. And Andreas?
We've just been given another hour and 15 minutes, so we have time. No, just two points. Yeah. Two points very quickly. One is today, onshore wind power and photovoltaic power plus storage plus intelligent management systems are cheaper than running existing coal-fired power plants. If it were an economic question only, then all new investment would go into renewable energy and no new investment would go into the fossil energy sector or the nuclear sector. The problem is that we still have so many regulatory frameworks and subsidies with perverse incentives that are stopping what would naturally happen, and that is that the energy transformation would be self-stabilizing, self-sustaining, self-replicating, and it would be self-accelerating. It would happen very quickly, and it would save so much money that we would have the fiscal space not only for 1% of ODA, but also for many other things that we need to do. The second point is even shorter, and that is this whole debate should have included the 70% of the Earth's surface that is the ocean. There is so much solution on climate and on food security that is in the ocean, and my recommendation to the organizers is next year let's have a panel on the blue economy and what it can produce on climate and on food. Thank you.
So, gentlemen, look, thank you. This has been a very rich discussion, as you can see by the number of questions that were asked and the number of questions that weren't asked. And so, Andreas Kramer, Said Moulin, Hafez Khanem, Miguel Moratinos, thank you very much for your time. You've been generous with your insights and your passion, and you've been generous with your time and attention as well. So, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure moderating you. Coffee.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a coffee break and reconvene at 3:45. Thank you.